Despite their small size, piranhas are among the wildest predators in nature. Their razor-sharp teeth allow them to tear apart their prey in seconds. But what really makes them dangerous is their numbers. They move in packs. They surround their prey like a circle and don't stop until they've completely devoured it. China's global economic strategy works exactly like this. With technology investments, infrastructure projects, strategic partnerships, and even cultural and academic collaborations, it surrounds a region and declares its dominance there. The trade war with the United States has made China's moves in the global economy even more aggressive. This war, which started with tariffs, is developing not just as a commercial tension, but as a struggle for hegemony. China had to pursue an aggressive strategy to create new markets and supply chains. They are paying our people to China, and they are doing it. It has turned regions like Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America into new centers of production and consumption. Especially in Africa, infrastructure projects, loans, and industrial investments provided access to raw materials and cheap labor. While Washington was building walls, Beijing was building roads.
Why would a country manage an infrastructure investment project far, far beyond its own borders? Why would a country consider that it has existential interests in Bolivia, Peru, and Brazil? Because it wants to extend the competition for hegemony to Latin America, or when the time comes, to the Asia Pacific, the Middle East, and Africa as well.
The value created by Chinese companies through their investments in the African continent since the early 2000s has exceeded $2 trillion. Now, Africa has become established in China. In many sectors, Chinese firms are producing in Africa. Therefore, China is influential in Africa's industrial policies, and especially in its infrastructure policies.
Market access is very important for China. So, we also see diversification here, especially during a time when there are contractions in major markets due to things like trade wars. Gaining access to new markets and ensuring that Chinese goods reach those places more is the first and most important issue.
One moment you see them building a metro, bringing metro systems to Africa. Another moment, they're supporting Africa in highway construction, or they're helping with the renovation of a port. They do all of this in countries where mineral resources are strong. All of these efforts are positioning them to strengthen their own economy in the future.
Since there wasn't enough domestic consumption, they implemented a strategy to use this surplus savings abroad as financing and investment in a way that serves their own foreign policy goals. China took on the financing of infrastructure investments in many African countries. In fact, it wasn't just the financing. China also took on the construction itself along with the financing.
So, it positioned Africa as a supplier of raw materials and logistics for itself. At the same time, by selling Chinese products to Africa, it created a new market where it could strengthen its trade.
China managed to attract governments with low-interest loans and large-scale projects. However, the management of these projects was mostly left to Chinese companies. Just like piranhas surrounding their prey, Chinese companies managed to penetrate deep into the very veins of those countries. Even though employment opportunities were promised, most of the jobs were given to Chinese workers. Instead of contributing to the local economy, the continent's natural resources started to be rapidly transported to China. This process promised a system that consumed Africa's riches but left behind no sustainable development. When states became unable to pay their debts, China would take direct control of the projects, in a sense, seizing them. At the end of the day, while Africa's waters became more favorable for the piranhas, the chances for other fish to survive kept shrinking.
China has a policy of insisting on using its own engineers, foremen, and workers, especially in construction activities in countries where it invests.
In many African countries, small Chinatowns or Chinese cities have started to form. They sent workers from their own country. They employed them there on a campus. With this kind of model, China has actually increased its political influence as well.
Now, if we look at whether this has benefited African and Middle Eastern countries, I have to say that I stand right in the middle on this issue.
We don't interfere in the internal affairs of African countries, impose our will on the African countries, or attach any political conditions to the economic aid for Africa. Nor do we seek selfish political gains in our investment and financing cooperation with Africa. Ultimately, it is up to the people of China and Africa to judge whether China-Africa cooperation is good or bad. No one can deny the remarkable achievements of our cooperation.
The investments made by China don't so much break the country's basic investment rules as they coincide with existing investment gaps and regulatory loopholes in the country, which leads to the emergence of concepts like the debt trap.
We know that, up to now, there have been investments that were taken over because operating expenses or debts could not be paid. Of course, we haven't seen any political pressure or anything like that. Frankly, many political authorities, especially China experts in the United States, are concerned. Indeed, it's an undeniable fact that such a rapidly rising economic power will inevitably be turned into a political advantage at certain points.
Turkey is also a country they're interested in. For example, a company called BYD came to Turkey.
With the leadership of our president, an agreement will be signed, with your permission, between the world's largest electric vehicle manufacturer BYD and the Ministry of Industry and Technology of the Republic of Turkey, for BYD to invest in Turkey.
What do they do when they come to Turkey? They use this place like an automobile pipeline to reach the West.
Africa, Asia, Latin America, and now Turkey is next. Chinese companies are investing in Turkey. But why? When piranhas enter a new stream, they're quiet at first. But then, the familiar strategy begins. Surround, break apart, spread. The main reason these companies are turning to Turkey is Turkey's strategic location. Turkey has a customs union agreement with Europe. Chinese companies aim to use this advantage to enter the European market duty-free through Turkey. Chinese companies, which face heavy taxes in their own countries, see Turkey as a customs bridge.
The CEO published a map of Turkey. In every port, in every province, they've either bought companies or made offers to those companies. The reason? In that sense, Turkey's goal was to bring in foreign capital and open a corridor to Europe through this foreign investment.
But if Europe also enters a period of higher protectionism against China, then this protection will also apply to the export of Chinese products from Turkey.
So if we ask whether both countries are benefiting equally, I think there's a problem here. In other words, both countries are not benefiting equally from this type of economic relationship.
When we talk about China, the first thing that comes to mind in Turkey, the first thing we see, is of course our trade deficit. This is also our starting point for every discussion. Our trade deficit with China. As you know, Turkey already has a trade deficit, and China is the country that contributes the most to this, causing the largest deficit.
In other words, unfortunately, this has become the very nature of trade with China. This was also the origin of the trade war story. There was a very serious trade deficit for the United States. And the trade deficit, historically, if a country runs a large trade deficit, unfortunately, we have the historical experience that this often, God forbid, ends up in war.
According to 2023 figures, Turkey's exports to China in 1 year were about $3.5 billion. While Turkey's imports from China were around $45 billion. So we're actually talking about a gap that's not narrowing, but widening.
China's imports to Turkey have exceeded $50 billion, and we have almost no exports at all. So this is heading toward a very dangerous place. We are definitely facing this. People see the English issue as a matter of policy. China will constantly increase its brand presence because cooperation is possible. And since cooperation is also possible for various customers, cooperation is possible for different customers as well.
If you want to swim with a school of piranhas, you need to watch your back. Because if they spot an opening, they dive deep very quickly.
China, US cooperating. They want to help America. When they act together, this can lead to good results.
It's now clear that the economic relationship between Turkey and China is unbalanced and is developing in an environment that is becoming less and less sustainable each day. Chinese products are rapidly taking over Turkish markets. Turkey's trade deficit with China is reaching more dangerous levels every year. This trend also carries the risk of reducing Turkey to a market where only Chinese goods are consumed.
When we talk about our trade deficit with China, of course, what comes to mind are the Chinese products we see on the street and in the market. We think of consumer products, but that's just one side of it. Among the imports from China, there are also intermediate goods and, at the same time, capital goods. There are also machines.
In recent years, Turkey has been accelerating its oil exploration and extraction efforts. Now, to extract this oil, you need certain equipment. You need tellers. In the energy transition, you provide certain incentives for solar panels. You need solar panels. You need wind turbines. China actually appears as a power that supplies all of these and supplies them at affordable prices.
The solar energy investors say the same thing. As long as our glass companies produce glass and our aluminum companies produce profiles, we will equip these rooftops. All right, so far so good. Thank God, we have glass. We have aluminum profiles. So, what are we missing? Our panels, right? Now, it's good that you're outfitting all these rooftops, but in a situation where the lion's share goes to China, we brought this up. Let's produce these ourselves.
In Turkey, the wind industry, wind energy, well, our total installed capacity is 115,000 megawatts, and globally, we've reached 13,000 megawatts. This 13,000 megawatts has made us the sixth country in Europe with the highest installed capacity. As we reach 13,000 megawatts, the industry we built, along with other employment and service sectors, has made Turkey the fifth largest wind industry in Europe.
Technological competition is a seriously debated topic around the world. Now, this is starting to be conceptualized. For example, what we call techno-nationalism has begun. We actually see examples of this in Turkey as well. For instance, in the case of the domestic and national defense industry, or, the example of the domestic automobile, this is defined as techno-nationalism in the literature. But these are actually moves by countries to benefit from a large pool of technological knowledge, to reach higher levels in engineering, and to become part of the innovation process.
If you look at it, about 45% of our energy needs, so 45% of the energy we consume annually, comes from renewable sources. Within that, the share of wind energy is about 11%. And of course, this has also spread to the industry. It has led to development on the industrial side as well. A strategy was set in our country to build the power plants in a way that would utilize domestic industry as much as possible, bringing together local manufacturers and local industry.
China is trying to implement an alternative method in the energy sector. One of these, in the end, is the standard, classic energy methods we all know. These are based on oil, natural gas, and fossil fuels. China also said this: we need to move forward with new energy technologies, because the sun is always up there. The wind will keep blowing as long as the world turns. we absolutely need to invest in and develop technology for solar and wind energy. From that perspective, they invested a lot here and opened factories.
Just as China has had such a huge presence and dominance among producers globally for the past 20 years. In the last 20 years, especially from 2014 to 2015 to today, their strategy has been to rapidly develop wind technology and, at the same time, to quickly build wind power plants both offshore and on land. Of course, we see something similar in other newly emerging technologies as well.
China is so far ahead, it's unbelievable. In that sense, for us to be able to compete, we need to be producing the solar technologies that we currently import from China.
Many countries in Africa saw investments by Chinese companies as a great opportunity. However, over the years, the dependency created by these investments left those countries facing low-wage labor and debt traps without any technology transfer. Today, the situation in Turkey looks similar. While Chinese companies are manufacturing here, they avoid sharing knowledge and technology. Local producers are struggling to compete on price. As Turkey becomes more integrated with Chinese investments, it also faces the possibility of encountering difficulties and restrictions in accessing major markets like the United States and Europe. Even though the outlook seems bleak, there is still a way out for Turkey. By following a balanced strategy, it's possible to both take advantage of investments coming from China and keep strong ties with Europe and America.
Most recently, last year, we refer to these as the double meetings held in China. As a result of these double meetings, a decision was made stating that China now needs to move to a new type of production model. New productive forces. In other words, new productive forces. Or maybe what we could translate as new production forces. So, what did China's economic elites or leaders mean by this? Now, chips, advanced technology, batteries, electronics, and digitalization need to come to the forefront.
Lithium cells and lithium batteries are used extensively in vehicles, especially electric vehicles. At the same time, just like what we're doing here, they have a wide range of uses in power plants, industrial facilities, homes, caravans, and boats.
Now, instead of sectors like textiles or traditional consumer products, where China was dominant 15 to 20 years ago, we need to focus on more advanced, technology-driven production that requires specific engineering knowledge. This also includes work on artificial intelligence and digitalization.
The best and most efficient formula is lithium. China saw this and invested heavily in this area. They established a lot of institutes. They trained people with doctorates and master's degrees in these institutes. As a result, they developed a highly skilled workforce. And they built a structure where they managed the entire supply chain from end to end.
After the Cyprus operation, the first embargo imposed on us was on military radios. It was on their batteries and power cells. Our businessmen from Kayseri showed great patriotism by establishing a battery factory and delivering it turnkey to the military.
The past has taught us a painful lesson. When we couldn't produce our own technology, we became subject to the will of others. As long as we remained dependent on foreign sources for critical technologies, our industry kept losing strength. The more we imported batteries, automotive parts, electronic devices, renewable energy components, and many other things, the more we became hollow inside. Quietly, almost without noticing, but it's still not too late. We still have the power to turn the gears in the opposite direction. By producing its own technology, Turkey can not only reverse its imports, but also change its destiny.
But if you ask, is there a battery factory in Turkey? Well, this is the first one. Right now, we are inside Turkey's first private sector nickel-cadmium battery factory. Before this, there was never a factory of this kind or this size. But here's the great part. from Europe, that is, from Italy to China, there isn't any other factory like this. This is the first factory. That's really something important.
With the breakthroughs we've made in alternative energy, we've started to offset this. Thank goodness. We're doing well with a manageable current account deficit. But in energy, when it comes to imports and exports, that's not the case. With a gap of around 10%, 3%, 4%, or 5%, I definitely need to take steps to do business together with China, right at the heart of it.
We're very dependent on China. The solar cells we call photovoltaic cells come from China. We import them here. Then, on an assembly line here, we combine them to make a panel. More than 80 factories have been established for this. But there are some problems. If you can't secure the supply of those cells, for example, if the cell manufacturer in China says, "I'm not making this cell anymore, I'm making a different one now," then your panel factory becomes useless.
The machinery sector in Turkey is very advanced. But what does China do? They bring both their own capital and their own credit to make the purchase. When they go to another country, they build highways, they build infrastructure, but they say, "You will only work with me, you won't let anyone else in here." So, in a way, Chinese goods are spreading around the world with capitulations, reaching those in need.
So how does China manage to produce things so cheaply? They have massive government support behind them. Production lines supported by subsidies help lower costs. Chinese companies even sell products below cost abroad to wipe out the competition. If Turkey doesn't develop these technologies on its own soil, every new import will make it one step more dependent. Every part that is bought will feel like a lost opportunity at home. A country that can't produce its own technology ends up at the mercy of others' plans for it. And that plan is generally implemented for the good of that country.
China isn't putting pressure from just one direction. As a whole state policy, maybe it directs 10 of its companies here. And those 10 companies try to carve up this place like piranhas and take over your market. Then, after they've taken over, they gradually start raising the prices.
Therefore, they start making investments that will disrupt Europe's production line and production axis. Actually, China's big goal is this. I think China wants global governance. As a global power, China wants to have influence not only in management, but also in the governance of the world and its population. Some of us wanted to go there and start a company. But there's something about the business culture in China. If you're going to do business with them, they will require at least a 50% partnership, and in fact, with 51%, they will have control over the management. So, in that sense, if China's economic hegemony isn't stopped, it will spread everywhere like a kind of sludge, covering everything. How can that be stopped? Now, the whole world is already talking about this.
At a time when global supply chains are being reshaped, Turkey stands out with its strategic location and production capabilities. Turkey, which serves as a bridge between Europe and Asia, stands out not only for its geography but also for its logistics and skilled workforce advantages. Rising geopolitical developments and the trend to reduce dependence on China are pushing Western countries to consider alternative suppliers. Turkey has now become one of the strongest candidates to fill this gap. Thanks to its high-quality production infrastructure, skilled workforce, and the customs union, Turkey can quickly access the European market. All these factors are turning Turkey into an attractive manufacturing hub for companies seeking sources outside of China. Moreover, it's not just Europe. Labels that are not made in China are becoming increasingly important in the American market as well. Turkish products also have the potential to fill this gap. Turkey feels the potential in its DNA to double its exports by turning shifting global dynamics into an opportunity.
First of all, our sector is trying to compete with Far Eastern manufacturers as much as possible. At this point, it is striving to manufacture in the most efficient way possible. When it comes to competitiveness, we always try to be competitive in terms of costs, human resources, and other inputs like energy, aiming to produce the product as cheaply as possible in these areas. We truly have a strong partnership with the government on this matter.
Everyone, every country, is trying to protect and develop its own local industry. So this is a parameter that we frequently discuss right now in Turkey-China relations as well. For example, when it comes to electric cars and automobiles. Yes, we want Chinese investments to come, but not in a way that brings in cheap cars and reduces the competitiveness of our local brands. Instead, come invest in Turkey, create jobs here, do R&D in Turkey, and if possible, share technology with Turkey.
Turkey must take planned and determined steps to become a production hub. This won't happen with just a few incentives and foreign investors. A long-term industrial policy is needed. Every step, from infrastructure to human resources, from R&D to financing, must be planned.
As much as possible, we need to attract investments to Turkey, investors who will generate knowledge, conduct R&D, utilize Turkey's human resources, manufacture in Turkey, and use these products within Turkey, just as you mentioned. Of course, we also need to develop a strategy that will actually put these plans into action.
The materials used in battery chemicals are mostly lithium-based. For example, iron, phosphate, graphite. These are actually elements that exist in Turkey as well. So if we can develop these technologies, if we place a bit more emphasis on R&D and incentives here, establishing these facilities in Turkey with this technology could help us break away from China's supply chain and open up new opportunities for us.
As of 2025, Iraq's imports from China are exactly $3 billion higher than the amount of products Turkey imports from China. China is no longer just a distant global player. It has entered Turkey's markets and has become an economic neighbor. And this isn't even a warning, it's a reality happening right now.
China is a global power, absolutely. China's borders may not be expanding in a physical sense, but in an abstract sense, they're expanding. In other words, China has interests in Iraq. Iraq is a country from which China buys oil and meets its energy needs. So, in a way, we can now say that China is Turkey's neighbor. And unfortunately, there are also serious issues between China and Turkey when it comes to regional matters. All of these issues are open to negotiation and should be discussed.
Of course, we need to look at the tools Turkey has at its disposal. Turkey acts according to the tools and scale it possesses. It has to. Because China can suddenly signal that it's ready to make a $500 billion investment. It can enter a country all of a sudden and build a $500 million dam. In this sense, Turkey is trying to hold its own in this strategy, competing with its own scale and capacity. But there are also areas where we can compete.
About 75 to 80% of this sector operates through China. It's progressing. I mean, from raw materials, to technology, to total sales, even to electric vehicles. China has a hand in all of them. But in areas where we can compete, for example, there are very few factories in Europe. Likewise, in Europe, there are a lot of problems with the operation of the factories that have been established. Turkey's advantage is, first of all, compared to Europe, it's much more hardworking.
To be honest, in order to reach the world's major markets, you need to have very advanced technologies and factories with very high capacity. That's why I think Turkey can create big demand for itself by combining smaller demands. Lines should be drawn.
Compared to Europe, we're much more practical, even as engineers. We can penetrate the market more quickly and efficiently. Our advantage over China is that we're close by. This geographical proximity is very important in battery operations, because as soon as you produce a battery, you want to consume it. You want to use it. Batteries that sit around always lose some performance. There will be drops in performance. It takes about a month and a half to bring any product from China to Europe. But from here, we can ship a product from Turkey to anywhere in Europe within a week. All of these are huge advantages.
Turkey's manufacturing strengths are clear. Out of the 200 most imported products in the world, Turkey is dominant in 65 of them, which is a lot. Frankly, these are things that could even be sold to China. Because when it comes to that, our manufacturing capabilities are really strong. Plus, we have another advantage. We're very close to Europe. In other words, we're much closer to target markets than China is. For example, we've experienced this ourselves. Instead of buying from China, they buy from us, the raw material, etc. But when we buy Turkey's own raw materials from China, in no way does it provide any benefit to us. If you don't develop a perspective or structure for this, you end up being the loser.
I mean, we've been doing high-level trade with Europe for years. Our biggest market is Europe. As Turkey, we send 60% of our high-quality goods there. That's why our communication with them is still. Even though more and more Chinese are getting involved, much better, much more transparent, and much more understandable compared to China. These are, for example, extremely important for Turkey's battery industry, in my opinion. Advantages.
The state should have a comprehensive China strategy, just like the Chinese have a Turkey strategy. Two separate. Universities are focused solely on studying Turkey. Turkey absolutely needs to have a specific agenda regarding China in this area. Plus, you can't deal with China just by imposing quotas or taxes, because China has already spread everywhere.
Because against China, as long as China knows us better than we know it, we will not make China an actor equal to ourselves. We have no chance. Economically, we can't make ourselves an actor equal to them anyway. It's just not possible. There's a serious difference in caliber compared to the world. A giant population, a giant economy. But at the very least, if we watch China more closely than China watches us, we can make it an actor equal to ourselves.
For example, just as we tried to understand the United States and developed a certain type of relationship with it, the same process will now take place with China. So, as long as we don't understand the issue of China's unique style, China-style growth, China-style economy, China-style political structure, as long as we can't figure these out, most likely, we will continue to be negatively affected by China. And not just as Turkey, but as the whole world.
For a long time, the world has been the stage for the struggle between the established giants of the West and the rising powers of Asia. Turkey, on the other hand, has found itself right in the middle of these two poles and has started to become not just an observer, but also a player that shapes the direction. In today's changing world, Turkey's role in the realm of tariff barriers will be defined by the steps it takes. So, what path will Turkey choose in this new balance? Will it strengthen its domestic industry and export high value-added products to America and Europe? Or will it remain just an import market for the giants of the East? The answer to this question lies in the decisions made today. It's hidden in the strategic steps that will be taken. The answer to this question will determine Turkey's future. Will Turkey become a country that produces and sells to the world? Or will it remain a country that only consumes and is dependent on imports?